Hello, this is Steve, and I'm reading from Decanter Magazine. Australian wine is easy to like, but it's baffling to understand. What are appellations? Frameworks for understanding. Wine could easily lose meaning under a savage libertarian regime, say, where trademarks ruled and where even geopolitical origin was unprotected. Appellations draw together the threads of understanding from the past, from the countless successes and failures of those who have worked particular vineyards in particular places in order to try and find the best outcome for every plot, grower, and drinker. The land turned into song, or songs, recognizable melodies of scent and flavor. That's the ideal. It's inappropriate in lands with short wine histories, geographical circumscription based on some kind of topographical and climatic logic is then enough. After a century or two of successes and failures, we'll know more. Older winelands, by contrast, what matters is that appellation law doesn't become constrictive. Evolution never stops, understanding continually deepens. The history of both science and art is full of revisionary churn. There is a cause for democratic accountability in how appellations are run. When Europe's wine laws were codified between 1930 and 1980, most growers had no technical education, and prescriptive rules were designed to help the unknowing avoid failure. The situation is very different today. Bravo, then, to Austria for its courage in revising its wine laws and for allowing growers a say in the regime for which they wish to work. There's only one drawback. The creature we have at present is neither a caterpillar nor a butterfly, but a phantasmagorical blend of both. Austrian wine is easy to like, but baffling to understand. At present, two fundamentally different systems coexist, Germanic and Romanic. Germanic was the old way, Pratetswein, Kabinett, Spätlese, Auslese, and so on, and the Austrian category of Ausbruch, a kind of azul, defined by must wait, the sugar and the grapes at harvest. Such wines come from Austria's 16 regions, and more general names are also used like Burgenland or Niederösterreich, Lower Austria, as well as village names. Romanic is the new way, regional names from specified grape varieties without regard to must wait and fermented dry. Such regions are called Districtus Austriae Controllatus, which sound like a Hogwarts spell. The welcome abbreviation is DAC. Now there are 9 of these. Why not more? They have to be wanted and claimed, democracy in action. Not every region is sure it wants one yet. The Wachau, meanwhile, has gone its own way with a kind of Germano-Romanic club called the Vinia Wachau Nobilis Districtus. Must-waits feature, but the wines are dry-ish. There are 3 categories, also Potteresque. Steinfeder, stone feather, the local name for the Stipa pinana grass, for the freshest and lightest. Federspiel, feather play, a leather band with feathers attached used as a lure in falconry, for those of medium weight, and Smagrad, a local green lizard, for the richest and most succulent. Smagrad was originally called Hornivogel or honeybird until a Mrs. Hornivogel demanded a royalty on each bottle. Despite, or perhaps because of, the colorful names, this has become a success with consumers, though there are producers like Peter Wader Malberg who opt out. It's all based on must-wait. Must-wait to me is nothing. I don't even use a refractometer. Growers elsewhere have private classifications, notably the Estre Lagen of the Austrian Rieschen Tradition Weingutter, the Association of Australian Traditional Wine Estates. It has produced 3 classifications since 2010, the Kamptal, Kremstal, Trienstal, and the Wagram. And the aim is to include vineyards in all the Danube regions. The wines must be made from Riesling or Gruner Veltliner and be dry. Erste Lage is a German language equivalent to Premier Cru, and the association plans a Grosse Lage, Grand Cru, in due course. A group called the Styria, calling itself STK, Styrische Terroir and Klassing Weingütler, meanwhile has gone ahead with its own Erste Lage and Grosse Lage classification for wines from different grapes, also made, except for Traminer, in the dry style. It's also a private initiative, a clear contrast to the classifications of this sort, Romanic, France, which are open to all and have the force of law. Perhaps Other uniquely Australian nomenclature includes Gemeisker, Satz, young unbottled field blends of mixed varieties grown near Vienna and drunk in the city's Jurgen wine cellars, and the recently awarded 9th DAC, and Udhuller, a simple wine from hybrid varieties, chiefly in Sudburgenland. All this, let me remind you, for a nation with less land under vine than the Loire Valley. Perhaps it's magnificent, an assiduous and free-thinking effort to do the land justice. To Austrians, it may make sense. Export consultants, though, would probably say it's mad. The risk is that consumers will pass on to a less rewarding but more comprehensible wine from elsewhere. Hugh Johnson. Someone who smiles, doesn't put on airs, or stand on rank would be described as approachable. Not quite cuddly, approachable still implies a certain distance or perhaps a degree of respect. But what does it mean when applied to wine? Different things, of course, in different contexts. At best, it can describe a great wine generous enough to conceal its potent structure. At worst, it can be a Weasley way of saying feeble. There are as many ways of understanding and appreciating wine as there are ways of describing it. We scribblers are always getting carried away, frequently, I fear, leaving our readers floundering. I had the jolliest dinner the other night in a pub with farmer friends who were quite sure of the wine they wanted. I like Spanish, was their simple solution. I suggested Italian, not out of be-mindedness, but because I spotted a bargain. They went along out of politeness until they tasted the Montepulciano d'Abruzzo. This is really nice. I didn't know Italian wine tasted as nice as this, so what is the difference really? What would you say? There's an unspoken agreement that Spanish wines are like this, Italian wines like that, Chilean different in this way, and Australian in that, while French are, you have a go. I had to have a stab. Italian wines, I said, generally taste of fruit, of different flavored grapes. Spanish wines taste of the cellar, of age. In a way, this makes sense because Italy uses so many grape varieties and has so many regional and provincial idioms, while Spain sticks to a few ubiquitous vines and methods, or at least I did until very recently. I parried. Sarah Kemp. The phrase lies, damn lies, and statistics was attributed to Disraeli by Mark Twain, and every time we publish the Decanter Report on our readers' drinking habits, I can't help but be reminded of it. Yet statistics are oddly compelling, and I must admit to spending many hours engrossed in our latest, where more than 1,000 of you told us what you were drinking and spending on wine today. And let me first thank you all who answered our extensive questionnaire earlier this year. For 25 years, Bordeaux has topped the poll of wine you drink most often. Despite all the negative comments we receive from readers regarding Bordeaux pricing, it seems it still retains a place in your hearts and cellars. In fact, the top 3 regions have stayed the same since 2001, Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhone. New Zealand wines remain the most popular from the New World, while Australian wine, which in our survey in 1994 came in 3rd place ahead of the Rhone, fell back. Decanter's Guide to Decanting, Part 1. In the first of a 3-part series exploring the merits of decanting, Gerard Basset, MW, MS, OBE, Stephen Brooke, and Stephen Spurrier begin to experiment with 3 vintages from Puyax Lynch-Bages, Schaefer's Hillside Select Cabernet from Napa. Margaret Rand reports. Bordeaux and Napa Valley. A magazine called Decanter would, you might expect, cover the subject of decanting in some detail. Yet we don't, do we? We write about buying wine, storing it, and what it tastes like, but the interval between opening the bottle and tasting the wine is left to your discretion. That period of time, be it 5 minutes or 5 hours, can make or mar a wine. The only consensus you'll find, if you ask for advice, is that wine that has thrown off a sediment needs to be decanted off it, and that old wines shouldn't be decanted too far ahead lest they die in the glass. So we decided to take the bull by the horns, the bottles by the corks, the decanters by the stoppers, and find out more. First of all, which wine should be decanted? The conventional wisdom is correct. A deposit in the bottle signals a need for decanting, or you'll be straining it through your teeth. That means red wines with tannin and bottle age, Bordeaux, Port, Rhone, that sort of thing. Professor Émile Peynaud, the late great transformer of many a Bordeaux chateau, believed that separating wine and sediment was the only reason to decant. But Stephen Spurrier suggests Peynaud was mostly concerned with preserving freshness because he spent his life persuading producers to make vibrant wines. But such prosaic reasons are not the only ones. Wines open with aeration. Wine that is tight and glum at first can become vivacious and talkative after time in a decanter. It's the equivalent of charm school, or it can be. To what extent can decanting substitute for a few more years of bottle aging? That's one of the things we wanted to find out. All sorts of wines were decanted in the past. Sauterne, dry whites, even champagne. Getting rid of bottle stink was one reason. Back in ye olden days, wine occasionally smelled quite off when first opened, and aeration let that come away to reveal the beauty underneath. It doesn't seem to happen now, but with very old wines it presumably could. In Bordeaux, the usual way is to either double decant, pouring the wine back into the original bottle and restoppering, or to decant and stopper the decanter about an hour or two before serving. Burgundy, being less tannic, and is less likely to throw a lot of deposit, though old wines might have done. The more tannic Italian wines were traditionally not decanted, but it might be opened the day before. Old Riojas, having been aged for eons in wood, didn't throw a deposit in the bottle, so decanting was only necessary if the wine seemed a bit stinky. In a restaurant nowadays, if you order a red and ask for it to be decanted, and then have a white first, the decanter will likely arrive at your table about 45 minutes after the wine has been opened. So many traditions, so many reasons. We decided to start at the obvious place, with red Bordeaux, choosing Pauillac, fifth growth, Lynch-Bages, and to pair it with Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon on a very different style and structure, Schaefer's Hillside Select. In the December issue, we'll open 3 bottles of ports, a classic Cinco Quinta and a vintage from one of the newer boutique producers. In the January issue, we'll focus on Rhone, Syrah, and Barossa Shiraz. Will we be able to establish firm guidelines for decanting? Read on. Methodology. There are 2 things to consider: how long to leave a wine in the decanter, and how decanting compares with simply opening the bottle. So we settled on 4 aeration times: 4 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour, and immediately before serving. 2 bottles of each wine were opened at each of these times. 1 was decanted, 1 not. The stoppers were not put back in. The decanters, supplied by Riedel, were of a classic shape that exposes a large but not exaggerated surface to air. The wines were kept all day in our air-conditioned tasting room, so were served at the same temperature as at all our tastings. All were decanted by Gerard Basset. See video on decanter.com/decantingwine from 9:30 a.m. onwards, and were served in flights to a precise timetable so that aeration times stayed accurate throughout. The wines were not tasted blind. We departed from our usual practice here because we weren't trying to determine which wines were the best. To avoid confusion, wines opened just before the tasting, rather than an hour or more ahead, are referred to as just opened, whether decanted or not. The wines that were opened but not decanted are referred to as non-decanted. Why these vintages? One of the perennial decanting puzzles is how to adjust the time of aeration to the age of the wine. The usual advice is to give less aeration to old wines, but do young wines benefit from more time? We picked 3 vintages for this tasting. We wanted 1 vintage at its peak, 1 beginning to drink well, and a young one needing more time. Jean-Charles Gage of Chateau Lynch-Bages suggested 1996 for the mature vintage, 2000 for the nearly drinking vintage, and 2006 for the young vintage. All are very good years, and we approached Lynch-Bages in the first place because it combines both modernity and classicism and is a wine both bought for drinking, not for speculation. Doug Schaefer matched them, vintage for vintage, with his Hillside Select. Inevitably, the Schaefer was not at exactly the same stage as development as the Lynch-Bages. Hillside Select 2006 is more approachable now than Lynch-Bages 2006, for instance, but it was clear why you should lay down the Hillside Select for 17 years. Hillside Select is Napa Cabernet to its toes, with all the lush power you would expect, but the elegance and structure of a hillside wine. The parallels were good. What goes on in a decanter? The process of aeration, in effect a very gentle oxidation, is not that well understood, according to Jeff Taylor of Wine Laboratory Corkwise. He portrays a battle of oxygen versus antioxidants being waged at the point at which wine meets air. If that point is very small, as it is in a bottle that has been uncorked but not decanted, the battle will be very slow. If the surface of the wine exposed to air is greater, if the wine has been decanted, double decanted, decanted and given a shake, or given any other speeding up treatment, It will be faster. First of all, Taylor says, the wine contains natural antioxidants. The younger and bigger and heavier the red wine, the more it will have. So there is sulfur dioxide, usually added at bottling to prevent oxidation before we're ready for it. SO2 also inhibits the aromas of wine. When the wine is open, Taylor asks us to imagine a molecule of oxygen coming towards the wine like a football. The SO2, or some other natural antioxidant, grabs the oxygen and prevents it from oxidizing the wine. Chateau Lynch-Bages, 2006, alcohol 13%. This was, by any standards, a young wine that none of the panel would have opened for drinking at this stage. If they had, they'd have been expecting to decant it, and it became clear that aeration was not a panacea nor a substitute for maturity. Even the wines that had been in a decanter or opened for 4 hours had not turned into silky, seductive creatures that is a mature Lynch-Bages. The tannins were still pretty brutal, though 4 hours did a fair job of smoothing them out. Nevertheless, the 4-hour wines weren't anyone's favorite. The tannins were smoother, but the wines were getting just a touch flat. The left-open wines weren't a lot of fun, and the middle ground seemed to be the happiest place. For Gerard Basset, the 2-hour wines were best, followed by 1 hours. Stephen Spurrier and Stephen Brooke both agreed, which left the question of whether to decant. There weren't huge differences between them, said Brooke. In general, the decanted wines were a little more open and sweeter on the nose and softer on the attack, but on the mid-palates there were no significant differences. The character of the wine stayed the same, he said. In context of a dinner table with food and a swirl of conversation, would anyone notice? 2000. Alcohol, 13%. This is a wine that, as Stephen Brooke said, you could drink, but it still had a lot of tannins. Initially softer, with strong savory tones, a touch more rustic than the 2006, but still jolly good was his description. A very rich wine, certainly the richest of the Lynch-Bages trio. If the panel had seemed a bit baffled after the first flight, they were a lot more confident now. Differences were much more clear-cut, said Brooke. The just-opened and 1-hour wines were better decanted. They had an extra dimension that the non-decanted wines lacked. More breadth of fruit, more generosity. At 2 and 4 hours, though, it was less clear, and the decanted wines, especially at 4 hours, had more meaty tones of oxidation, of acceleration, and of accelerated development. For him, 2 hours and not decanted was the best. When it came to 2-hour wines, however, Stephen Basset and Stephen Spurrier both preferred the decanted versions, and Spurrier preferred the decanted 4-hour wine, while Basset found the 4-hour wines pretty equal. Generally, though, 4 hours again seemed too long. Both were going away, said Spurrier. They were losing their freshness. This was becoming a refrain of the tasting. It was already becoming clear that longer aeration is not better. 1996. Alcohol, 13%. Stephen Spurrier defined this vintage as a classic Cabernet year with structured wines that are taking their time to come round. Stephen Brooke noted an herbal quality which I like, but which may not be appreciated in the U.S. Brooke liked the way the non-decanted wines kept their freshness and vibrancy, except for the just-open pair, where the brief aeration of the decanted version seemed better. He agreed that many people would prefer the roundness of the decanted wines all the way through. It's a wine that needs aeration, said Spurrier. The 1-hour decanted wine shows at its peak, whereas the 1-hour open is still a bit grippy, but will keep on developing through a dinner. Of the 2-hour wines, I love the fresh aroma of the opened wine, but it was green on the palate and lacked the chocolate note of the decanted wine. The just-opened pair, Gerard Basset, found similar. One of the 1-hour wines, he preferred the decanted one, more complete, but only by a whisker. And the 2-hour wines also he found to be equal. The only consensus was that again, 4 hours was a bit too long. Basset found the non-decanted version more together. Spurrier found it fresher, though this is not how it should be. While Brooke found it fresher, though some may prefer the decanted wine's more mellow quality. Schaefer Hillside Select Cabernet Sauvignon. 2006, alcohol 14.9%. Gerard Basset described this wine as readier to drink than the Lynch-Bages 2006, rounder and more approachable. I wouldn't drink the Lynch-Bages yet, but you could drink this. The texture, everything is different. Stephen Brooke agreed. It's more in your face, it's massive primary fruit, and not much subtlety. Decanting times made far more difference here than the Lynch-Bages 2006. There, tasters found that the wine remained itself no matter what you did to it. Here, since the wine was more evolved to start with, decanting evolved it even more. For the first time, 4 hours in decanter didn't seem too much, at least to Stephen Spurrier. The 1 hour wines were very different to the just opened wines, and the 2 hour wines were different again. Both 2 hour wines had opened up, but had lost their vibrancy of fruit, and so were a bit flat. They hadn't had time to become complex, he said. But I really liked the 4 hour wines. The extra 2 hours allowed the wine to take on new life. 2 hours shut it down, and 4 hours brought it back. It aged a year or two. It was terrific. Of the 4 hour wines, his slight preference was for the decanted one. Brooke and Bassett both liked the 2 hour wines best. More complexity, said Bassett, especially the non-decanted wine, and Brooke concurred, though found it hard to choose between the two. A decanted wine was more evolved, and both the 4 hour wines were lacking in aromatic intensity. Schaefer 2000, alcohol 14.8. This wine was a lot less evolved than the Lynch-Bages 2000. Still all primary fruit, with no secondary savory notes. Very youthful. For the first time, said Stephen Spurrier, I preferred the non-decanted wine of the just opened pair. It had lively cassis fruit, vigor, and freshness. Decanting just allowed it to mature a bit so that the richness came out. But for the rest of the flight, I prefer the decanted version. 2 hours helped the decanted wine to open and show its alcohol, richness, and complexity, but the non-decanted wine had stopped in its tracks. At 4 hours, he found that the more the wine is open, the more it absorbs the sugars and lets the finesse shine. Stephen Brooke disagreed. At 4 hours, he found oxidation and evolution marked in both wines. They still had massive fruit, but they were flat. He preferred the non-decanted wines at all stages, more precision and tautness, except for the just opened pair, where the decanted wine jumped out of the glass. What he especially noticed was that between 2 and 4 hours, the profile changed. Less cassis vibrancy and more brooding characters, odd as a consequence of aeration. His tip was to pour from the bottle and allow much aeration. Gerard Basset preferred the decanted wines except at 1 hour, where he favored the non-decanted. My least favorite pair was the 4 hour wines. They didn't have that finesse, so our trio agreed on the difference created by long aeration, just not on whether they liked it. And the Schaefer Hillside 1996, alcohol 14.3. Stephen Brooke described this wine as classic Californian Cabernet from a fine year. It has excellent balance and great power and enormous fruit, even at 16 years. It's more evolved than 2000, but not in a negative way. Gerard Basset felt that decanting made more difference here than in the other Schaefer flights, as did time, and accordingly, at 4 hours, he preferred the non-decanted wine. At 4 hours, but 4 hours he felt was too long. At 1 and 2 hours and decanted were his favorites. And these times, particularly at 1 hour, he found the biggest difference between decanting and not decanting. Stephen Spurrier's preference was for very brief decanting, an hour at the most. Maybe 15 minutes in decanter, 10 minutes in the glass is best. Longer times act against the fruit and flatten it, so you only get the tannins. Brooke confessed to being all over the place in his opinions. The 1996 holds up to aeration better than the 2000. I like the 4 hour pair here, but I didn't with the 2000. Each pair had its differences, but was difficult to know which I preferred. His favorite in the flight was the wine decanted at 2 hours, but of the 4 hour wines he liked the exuberance and vinosity of the non-decanted version. Again, opinions were far more varied and far less clear than they were for the Lynch-Bages 1996. The safest route seems to be decant the wine, but not for too long, and more than 2 hours is risky. Conclusions. Some aeration is usually better than none. Decanting makes a difference over not decanting. Whether you may like that difference may be a question of personal taste. Opening for 2 hours is not the same as decanting for 1 hour. Decanting 1 hour ahead is consistently good. Decanting 2 hours ahead can work well for younger wines. Longer decanting periods are risky, and the more evolved the wines, the greater the risk of oxidation in the decanter. Decanting but putting the stopper in the decanter can be a useful halfway house. Very rich wines can shed their puppy fat with long decanting. Conversely, very rich wines keep their freshness more by being opened and not decanted. Very tight wines can open up with decanting, but don't expect young, immature wine to be coaxed into maturity by decanting. Remember that our tasters were tasting and moving on, Normally a wine would be on the dinner table for an hour or more, so allow for that in your calculations. Less aeration before serving is safer than more. You can't bring a wine back once it has died. Readers' questions answered. What is natural wine? Following organic and biodynamic wine, natural wine is now becoming trendy. Could you explain the difference between these three approaches to winemaking? Organic, biodynamic, and natural wines share similar philosophies in the vineyard, but not in the cellar. Broadly speaking, biodynamic cellar practices tend to be stricter than organic ones, while the natural approach is the strictest of them all. To put it simply, organic viticulture doesn't use synthetic chemicals in the vineyard, though there are some exceptions to this rule. Biodynamics, meanwhile, is based on the teachings of innovative academic Rudolf Steiner and treats vines with homeopathic quantities of natural preparations applied according to the position of the moon and planets. Finally, natural wines are made without removing or adding anything in vineyard or winery, bar tiny amounts of sulfites. Natural wines are formed organically and biodynamically. There is not yet an official regulation of natural wines, and the regulation of organic and biodynamic viticulture varies, sometimes quite widely, between the various certification bodies. The lie of the land. I recently visited Bordeaux for the first time and was struck by how flat it is. Where did all this stuff about hillsides being the best come from? Apart from a hill going up to Coast Esternel, and it's not exactly a mountain, the Medoc is about as hilly as Holland. What's going on? Stephen Brooke replies, slopes perform two principal functions, exposure to sunlight and good drainage. The deep gravel soils of the Medoc give exemplary drainage, and the vineyards are not quite as flat as they look. The best are on shallow mounds that offer varying exposures. But you're right, it is something of a mystery that this barely rippling land produces such magnificent wines. And if you think the Medoc is flat, wait till you visit Coonawarra in South Australia. Crew member, I recently drank a bottle of Chateau Michelet Haut Medoc 2004. It was in very fine condition and very palatable. However, it is listed as a Cru Artisan, which I find most surprising. Although I have a comprehensive wine library, I cannot find any mention of it anywhere. Perhaps you could enlighten me. Margaret Rand replies, Cru Artisan was a category used in the 19th century to denote a property somewhere below a Cru Bourgeois in quality. It was given official status in 2006, and 44 properties were given right to use the term. Michelet is one of them, and is in the Cusack Fort Medoc. This is Steve, and I have been reading from Decanter Magazine.